1937. It's the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese Nazi Germany, soon to be allies, are readying their assault against the people of China, leading to one of the darkest and most brutal points in Chinese history, the Nanjing Massacre. Japanese soldiers are pillaging and attacking unarmed men, women and children throughout the city, racking up a body count in the hundreds of thousands. But one man in particular stands defiantly against them, a barrier between the Japanese soldiers and the Chinese people they're brutalizing. John Rabe, a businessman who manages Siemens China Company, is putting aside his own safety to try to save over 200,000 citizens who are flocking to his protection. The catch: Rabe is a German Nazi Party official. He should be supporting the Japanese, not standing in their way. So the question remains, why is a Nazi standing against his supposed allies and protecting the very people they targeted for destruction? John Rabe was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1882, but spent most of his adult life in his beloved China. In 1937, the Japanese invade China, bringing the conflict to his doorstep. The threat to Nanjing, builds the city of Nanking, is about to fall. Germans and American officials are fleeing, leaving only a small handful behind. John Rabe is one of them. He believes that to flee would be to mark the Nazi Party, a party in his eyes that supports the poor, as hypocrites. And so he remains. From September to November 1937, John Rabe is protecting his employees with his authority. His diaries almost cheerily discuss bombings and their dugouts, all while enjoying tea and his continued friendship with the Chinese citizens. But as the Japanese creep ever closer to Nanjing, plans begin to take shape. First, RBA joins the international committee composed largely of American doctors and professors, their purpose to figure out how to save the city from the inevitable looming invasion. By late November, only 3 officials from the German embassy remain in China. Rabe is elected chairman of the International Committee. Together they propose a large safe zone to cover much of Nanjing. Their plan is to guide unarmed civilians into these protected areas where the Japanese would agree not to harm them. But the Japanese soon refuse to put any formal agreement in writing, claiming they cannot agree to it, knowing that soldiers had crept into the safe zone. But despite his long tenure in China, Rabe still believes there are people in Germany who will listen to his pleas. With the Japanese bearing down, he sends 2 telegrams. One to the General Chilkel, requesting he support Rabe's petition to Hitler, the other to Hitler himself, asking him to intercede with the Japanese government and grant permission for a neutral zone for non-combatants. Given the immediate battle for Nanjing, he receives no reply. In the meantime, Rabe also receives instructions from the embassy to leave Nanjing. He replies politely but firmly refusing and restating his intention to stay and protect over 200,000 non-combatants. By November 27th, the city gates of Nanjing are closed. The safety zone is set up and Rabe is overseeing its general management and operations, including medicine, food and transport. A week later, air raids begin, and Chinese civilians move into the safety zone. John and his committee wait, stuck between various countries' political maneuverings. The committee continues to funnel supplies into the safe zone despite falling bombs and the promise of looming ground troops. Despite promises that the zone is for refugees only and not military personnel, on December 5th, the commandant of the city's defenses, General Tong, greets Rabe from a house within the safe zone. 5 days later, the Japanese radio announces Nanjing will soon fall. A diary entry by a Mr. Smith speaks of over 1,000 dead in one night at the city's south gate, and hundreds more, or within the safe zone. Further entries tell of the horror of a brutal and unfiltered attack from the soldiers against civilians' bodies litter the streets, and Rabe frequently stumbles across violent scenes that fill him with horror. At one point, he tries to negotiate with the Japanese if Chinese soldiers abandon their arms. Will they not treat them fairly? The answer, he finds out, is no. By the time the Japanese soldiers enter the safe zone on December 13th, B's diaries are filled with stories of the daily atrocities he witnesses. As the number of dead grows, so too do the staggering numbers of women violently attacked inside the safe zone, and across the city, looting increases from both Japanese and Chinese soldiers. But among the horror in the pages are moments of shining humanity throughout. Rabe shares stories of how he and his American fellows drive off Japanese soldiers with their mere presence, how his garden fills with over 300 refugees who consider his house the safest spot in Nanking, how he physically removes Japanese invaders from his home, and how he refuses to let harm come to those who have sought shelter under his wing. Although Rabe admits it's significantly easier for him than the Americans, all he needs to do is point to his Schwarzer armband and shout Deut or Hitler to get them to flee. On Christmas Eve 1937, his diary entry simply states, "I do not regret having stayed on here, for my presence has saved many lives, but all the same my suffering is indescribable." Throughout the Nanjing Massacre and razing of the city, Rabe and others continually write reports on what they witnessed. For Rabe's part, he seems sure those outside China aren't aware of the scale of the atrocities that were occurring. By mid-January 1938, Nanjing is being razed to the ground and successfully taken by the Japanese. Rabe believes no one remains outside the 200,000-strong safety zone, and those inside are struggling with food shortages and violent attacks from soldiers. On February 8th, the Japanese and Autonomous Government Committee announced the end of the invasion and immediate disbandment of the safety zone. Rabe tells those who have taken refuge in his garden that he would never make them leave, but he can also do little to protect them if the Japanese come in force to take them. In the end, the true toll of the Nanjing Massacre remains unknown. Rabe estimates between 50,000 to 60,000 dead, but modern sources place the figure between 200,000 and 300,000. He leaves Nanjing on February 23rd, a hero to its residents, beloved by the refugees he saved, and with the nickname the Buddha of Nanjing. He never stops thinking about what he witnessed there, writing yet again to hit Hitler, and enclosing a copy of a lecture he gave, telling the truth of what he witnessed in Nanking. But he also claims these records were only meant for documentation and not public consumption. In time, Rabe is arrested by the Gestapo and the Soviets on separate occasions, although both times he's released without incident. While mentions of Hitler or the Nazi Party are scarce throughout his diaries, he always writes of them commandingly and with a surface-level air of approval, however, after he rarely speaks of Hitler or the Nazi Party again. His biographer later concludes that he had no interest in them or their politics. Whether that was because of the response at and after Nanking or not is unknown. In the last years of the war, Rabe finds himself in Berlin, poor and living in his son-in-law's spare room as a pariah of Germany, the consequence of saving lives of the enemy. John Rabe dies of a stroke in Berlin on January 5, 1950. But his legacy lives on with monuments to his bravery both in Germany and in China. In the end, for John Rabe, it was never about Hitler's shining vision Nazi Party ideology or being a member. It wasn't even about being German. What it all essentially came down to, and why he decided to stay in Nanjing despite orders to the contrary, was one simple truth: he was a human being, and so were they. And bowed by that shared humanity and his love for the people of Nanking, he simply could not leave them behind. It was all so obvious, none of it has anything to do with heroics.